Welcome back. Tonight on Open Line, we are discussing the basic education program, that's state funding. So how your children's schools are funded. Joining me is Cour tonight. She's ready and available to take your questions. So if you have any questions related to funding and how schools are paid for, make sure you call in and we'll try and get to you. So Katie, we were talking a little bit during the commercial break about COVID-19 and how the pandemic has impacted schools. I know that a lot of those have been able to receive CARES Act or some type of aid. Can you just talk a little bit about how that's played a role?
Sure. So we had a couple things that happened. One is that the CARES Act passed and we received funding from the federal government, but we also had a special legislative session here in the state of Tennessee to really examine the learning loss that was created by the COVID crisis. And so the special session actually did a couple of things. It requires additional supports for students who might have gotten off track or who have had a lot of learning loss given the virtual environment that we've been in over the last year or so. And it requires summer programming for those students, so really helping them get up to speed over the summer. And we are supportive of that and think that that's a really good use of funds and energy. How that's going to be implemented is still a little murky, and it does put a lot of onus on the district to figure out things like transportation and supports for those students. But I'm still glad that we're going to be extending additional supports and think it's a worthy cause. The other thing that I'm really excited about with this legislative session is that it calls for teacher compensation to increase. And we don't pay teachers well, period, across the nation, in my opinion, but we certainly don't do a great job in the state of Tennessee or in across the Southeast. And so the fact that the legislature did call on all of us to really start investing more in our teacher pay is very exciting for those of us in education. The issue with the way that the legislation is written at the state level is that once it all kind of ultimately trickles down to metro schools, because we already pay our teachers above that state minimum teacher salary, we actually won't see a lot of extra dollars going into increases for teacher pay. So we need to do other things to make sure our teachers are well compensated, and on that, not only does it mean that they can live and have a good quality of life in a fairly expensive city, but it also shows that we as a community actually really value our teachers and really believe that they should be compensated appropriately. So those are just a couple of things, a couple different ways that that funding will be flowing to the district. Doesn't solve for the ultimate issue, which is that the funding formula itself needs to be overhauled, but still gives us some areas that we can at least hang our hat and be hopeful that will make some differences for kids this year.
On that note, what our students need and what do they need to be fully educated?
Yeah, so that is a fantastic question, and actually one that I would hope we as a community in Nashville could kind of solve together. Like, what do we really want for our kids, and what does a great education mean? I think we put a lot of emphasis on academic accountability metrics, things like, how many students are reading at grade level, how many students are graduating from high school, what is our ACT average. All of those things are incredibly important and really should be considered and thought through. But I think we miss the point of really figuring out what students need when they walk in the door. When we're only looking at those outcomes, which again, incredibly important, we kind of forget about what it means to be a student and enjoying learning in a classroom. And so at the foundation, we really focus on the conditions that are necessary for all students to thrive in a school. And those are things like a student needs to feel belonging and needs to feel welcomed in their school. They need to have engaging classes and engaging materials that are relevant to their learned experiences. And they really need to have incredible teachers who are well equipped to work with a variety of different types of students and learning needs. Our district is one of the most diverse in the state. We have just an unbelievably amazing group of students in metro schools. We're a majority minority district, so the majority of our students are students of color. We're 45% Black students. We have, I think, roughly a quarter of our students are Hispanic or Latinx. We have a large percentage of special education students, a large percentage of English learner students. We just have an incredibly robust, all of these things make us an exciting and diverse and interesting place to be, but they also mean that we need additional resources to make sure that we're meeting each of those different students' needs. And that's what we're calling on for the state to do differently.
If we were to sit down with teachers and principals tonight, would they say they have enough funding to do their job in Metro?
I hate to speak for teachers, but of all my teacher friends, I can guarantee that they would say they do not have enough funding. And honestly, everyone I know who teaches in Metro puts in of their own additional funds. I mean, thousands of dollars in some cases to meet their students' needs. Everything from, new classroom materials to cleaning supplies to, interesting books that a student might need access to. And so it's a field that is woefully under-supported in terms of resources, and in Tennessee we're at the bottom of that barrel. So in my opinion, teachers and principals are fully aware that we do not fund our schools adequately, and they actually are trying to make up the difference in many cases. That's why you see kind of GoFundMe campaigns, which are not even approved policy in many cases, that teachers are trying to create their own revenue streams for their students. That's something that I don't want to go to bed at night thinking that a teacher has to worry not only about a student learning a lot of information and engaging that student every day, but also how am I going to find the resources to make sure that the student has what he or she needs. That's just not a community that we should put up with. So I'm hopeful that we can make some changes.
I know you mentioned that other states are switching to either a hybrid model or a different funding system. For you, what would be best case scenario? Would it be an overhaul?
Yeah, so I absolutely think that we need an overhaul of the entire system. And so because we consider the cost associated with each item that is needed in a school, instead of considering what the student needs, it really skews the amount of funding that districts need. And like I said earlier, really underestimates what school districts need to operate. So a better way of funding schools, in my opinion, and in the foundation's opinion, is through a student-centered formula. And Kentucky is a good example of how that works. And so what Kentucky does is set a base amount for every student in the state. They say each student is going to get X amount of money. And then they apply a weight, an additional amount, given the student's circumstances that they're bringing to the classroom. So for instance, if a student is a special education student who is living in poverty, they will get additional funds for both of those circumstances that will allow the district to better meet the needs of that unique student. That happens if the student is an EL student, if the student is gifted and talented, if the student is, a variety of different demographics or issues that the student could bring to the table. That allows the flexibility for a district to actually meet the needs of that student. That student-centered formula is a much more equity-driven formula, and one that more adequately would meet our students' needs, particularly in a diverse city like Nashville. And so that's really what we are pushing for the state to do and really consider is more of an equitable funding formula.
All right, we do have a caller. Larry is on line 1. Hey there, Larry. You're on open line. Do you have a question for Katie tonight?
Yeah, sure. It's funny how they always use the buzzwords in education. And in education, they're always looking for the next best thing. Even before all this pandemic hit, they're always looking for the new thing, the new thing. They're always getting new stuff from the Federal Department of Education, the new posters, the new things and stuff. Let me tell you, it gets down to reading, writing, and arithmetic. And there's no correlation whatsoever between the amount of funding the school gets and the quality of education, their test scores. Now they're throwing test scores out. There's no correlation. Some of the highest funded schools in the country are the worst. And she'll say, oh, well, they're in bad neighborhoods and they're in poverty and stuff. Let me tell you something. There's different areas of the country that are poor, that are doing well academically, and there are certain parts, large cities, that are doing poor academically with tons of money thrown at me. Can she answer that?
Yes, I would be happy to. Yeah, I appreciate that question so much, Larry, because I think you're exactly right. And additional funding by itself is absolutely not going to solve our problems. It's how strategically and how thoughtfully and intentionally we use those funds. And so it's a both and. I think we are grossly underfunding our districts in the state of Tennessee, but we also need to make sure that our districts are using those funds wisely and as strategically as possible. So I fully agree that you can just throw more money at the problem and not see any results. But I think we need to both help districts use money strategically and increase the amount of overall funding we're giving our districts.
So you mentioned special needs children in Kentucky and how it's based on the student. So now how is it based for funding?
In the state of Tennessee?
Yes.
Or it could, yeah. And so it's based on what the state considers is needed for public education. And so it uses 46 different components, and it's everything from the teachers' salaries to those non-teacher positions that we have in schools that are so critical, to the cost of the principal, to the cost of the benefits that a teacher receives or that an employee receives in a district, to the cost of technology needed in a district, to the superintendent's salary. All of those things are put into the funding formula, and then there's a cost associated with each of them. And so instead of thinking about what the student is needing to be educated well, it considers only what these categories and the costs associated with them, and both of those things are flawed in our opinion. In particular, the costs associated with them are underestimating what it actually costs in a school district like metro schools.
So I know a lot of people who are saying, I want to move out of Metro right now. And a lot of it is due to, the schools or the property tax increase right now. A lot of people are talking about that property tax hike. Does any of that go to the schools?
So I'm not an expert on the property tax. I'll just admit that, and I know that the crisis in metro government was one that required additional revenue, or we were going to be out of compliance with the comptroller's office, and so I know that the property tax was necessary just to keep basic services running. If the property tax had not gone through, you would have seen things like libraries closing and potentially firefighters being laid off, but it certainly also would have affected metro schools. We would have had to have cut salaries, had to have cut teaching positions just to be able to fund our schools at the bare minimum. So the property tax has allowed us to at least stay solvent, but it's again, we have a long way to go in terms of how we're going to be changing the overall funding for our schools.
We do have to go to a commercial break, but if anyone wants to ask any questions for Katie before she leaves, please call the number on your screen.